Chapter 21 Under the City 1. It. August 1958. Something new had happened for the first time in forever. Something new. Before the anniversary, there had been only two things. One was itself, and the other was the turtle. The turtle was a stupid old thing that never came out of its shell. It thought that maybe the turtle was dead, had been dead for the last billion years or so. Even if it wasn't, it was still a stupid old thing. And even if the turtle had vomited the universe out whole, that didn't change the fact of its stupidity. It had come here long after the turtle withdrew to its shell, here to Earth, and it had discovered depths of imagination here that was almost new, almost of concern. This quality of imagination made the food very rich, its teeth rent, flesh gone, sniffed, with exaggerated terrors and vulturous fears. They dreamed of night beasts and movies muds. Against their will, they completed endless gulps. Upon this rich food, it existed in a simple cycle of waken to eat and sleep and to dream. It had created a bit of its own image, and it looked upon this place with favor from the deadlights, which were its eyes. Derry was its killing pen. The people of Derry, its sheep things, had gone. Then, these children, something new for the first time in forever, when it had burst up into the house on Neobold Street, meaning to kill them all, vaguely uneasy that it had not been able to do so already. And surely that unease had been the first new thing. Something bad happened, which was totally unexpected, utterly unthought of, and there had been pain, great roaring pain, all through the shape it had taken, and for one moment there had also been fear, because the only thing it had been in common with the stupid old turtle and the cosmologians of the microverse outside the punny egg of this universe was just this. All living things must abide by the laws of the shape they inhabited for the first time, and realized that perhaps its ability to change its shapes might work against it as well. As for it, there had never been pain before. There had never been fear before, and for a moment it had thought it might die. Oh, its head had been filled with a great white silver pain, and it had roared and mewed and bellowed, and somehow the children had escaped. But now they were coming. They had entered its domain. Under the city, 7 foolish children blundered through the darkness without lights or weapons. It would kill them now, surely. It made a great self-discovery. It did not want change or surprise. It did not want new things ever. It wanted only to eat and sleep and dream and eat again. Following the pain and that brief, bright fear, another new emotion had arisen, as all genuine emotions were now to it. Although it was a great mocker of emotions, anger it would kill the children because they had, by some amazing accident, hurt it. But it would make them suffer. First, because for one brief moment they had made it fear them. Come to me, then, it thought. Listen to their approach. Come to me, children, and see how we float down here. We all float down here. And yet there was a thought that insensinated itself. No matter how strongly it tried to push the thought, it was simply this: if all things flowed from it, as they surely had done since the turtle stepped up the universe and then fainted inside its shell, how could any creature of this or any other world fool it or hurt it, no matter how briefly or triumphantly? How was that possible? And so a last new thing had come to it, this not an emotion, but a cold speculation. Suppose it had not been alone, as it had always believed. Suppose there was another, and suppose further that these children were agents of that other. Suppose. It began to tremble. Hate was new. Hurt was new. Being crossed in its purpose was new. But the most terrible new thing was this fear. Not fear of the children that had passed, but the fear of not being alone. No, there was no other. Surely there was not. Perhaps because they were children, their imaginations had a certain raw power, had briefly imitated, but now that they were coming, it would let them come. They would come, and it would cast them one by one into microverse, into the deadlights of its eyes. Yes, when they got here, it would cast them, shrinking and insane, into the deadlights. 2. In the tunnels. 2:15 p.m. Bev and Richie had maybe 10 matches between them, but Bill wouldn't let them use them. For the time being, at least, there was still dim light in the drain. Not much, but he could make out next 4 feet in front of him, and as long as he could keep doing that, they would have the matches. He supposed the little light they were getting must be coming from vents and curbings over their heads, maybe even from the circular vents in manhole covers. It seemed surprisingly strange to think they were under the city, but of course by now they must be. The water was deeper now. 3 times dead animals had floated past: a rat, a kitten, a bloated shiny thing that might have been a woodchuck. He heard one of the others mutter disgustedly as that baby cursed by the water they were crawling through was religious plastic. But all that was going to come to an end fairly soon. There was a steady hollow roaring not too far up ahead. It grew louder, rising to a one-note roar. The drain elbowed to the right. They made the turn, and here were the 3 pipes, sweeping water into their pipe. They were lined up vertically like the lenses on the traffic light. They drained dead-headed here. The light was vertically brighter. Bill looked up and saw they were in a square stone-faced shaft about 15 feet high. There was a sewer grating up there, and water was sloshing down on them in buckets. It was like being imprinted in a shower. Bill surveyed the 3 pipes helplessly. The top one was venting water, which was almost clear, although there were leaves and sticks and bits of trash in it, cigarette butts, chewing gum, wrappers, things like that. The middle pipe was venting gray water, and from the lowest one came a grayish-brown flood of lumping sewage. Eddie floundered up beside him. His hair was plastered to his head. His cast was a soaking, dripping mess. Which one? If you wanted to know how to build something, you asked Ben. If you wanted to know which way to go, you asked Eddie. They didn't think about this, but they all knew it. If you were in a strange neighborhood and wanted to get back to a place you knew, Eddie could get you there, making lefts and rights, which undimnished confession until you were reduced simply to following him and hoping that things would turn out right, which they always seemed to do. Bill told Richie once that when he and Eddie first began to play in the Barriers, Bill, was constantly afraid of getting lost. Eddie had no such fear, and he always brought the 2 of them out right where he said he was going to. If I got lost in the Hansville woods and Eddie was with me, I wouldn't hurry a bit, Bill told Richie. He just knows my dad say some people, it's like they got a compass in their hands. Eddie's like that. I can't hear you, Eddie shouted. I said, which one? Which one what? Eddie had his aspartame clutched in his good hand, and Bill thought he actually looked more like a drowned muskrat than a kid. Which one do we take? Well, that all depends on where we want to go, Eddie said, and Bill could have cheerfully throttled him, even though the question made perfect sense. Eddie was looking dubiously at the 3 pipes. They could fit into all of them, but the bottom one looked pretty snug. Bill motioned the others to move up into the circle. Where the fuck is it? He asked them. Middle of town, Richie said prominently. Right under the middle of town, near the canal. Beverly was nodding. So was Ben. So was Stan. Mike? Yes, he said. It is, near the canal, or under it. Bill looked back at Eddie. Which one? Eddie pointed reluctantly at the lower pipe, and although Bill's heart sank, he wasn't at all surprised. That one. Oh, gross, Stan said unhappily. That's a shit pipe. We don't, Mike said. Mike began and then broke off. He cocked his head in a listening gesture. His eyes were alarmed. What? Bill began, and Mike put a finger across his lips and shh gesture. Now Bill could hear it too. Splashing sounds, approaching, grunts and muffled words. Henry still hadn't given up. Quick, Ben said, let's go. Stan looked back the way they had come. Then he looked at the lowest of the three pipes. He pressed his lips tightly together and nodded. Let's go, he said. Shit, washes off. Stan the man gets off a good one, Richie cried. Wacka, Richie, will you shut up? Beverly hissed at him. Bill led them to the pipe, grimacing at the smell, and crawled in him. The smell, it was sewage. It was shit. But there was another smell here, too. Wasn't it here? There? A lower, more vental smell. If an animal's grunt could have a smell. And Bill supposed if the animal in question had been eating the right thing, it could. It would be like this, under smell. We're heading in the right direction. All right, it's been here. And it's been here a lot. By the time they had gotten 20 feet, the air had grown rancid and poisonous. He squished slowly along, moving through stuff that wasn't mud. He looked back over his shoulder and said, You follow right behind me, Eddie. I'll need you. The light faded to the faintest gray, held that way briefly, and then it was gone, and they were out of the blue and into the black. Bill shuffled forward through the skink, feeling that he was almost cutting through it physically, one hand held out before him, part of him expecting that at any moment it would be encountered. Rough hair and green lamp-like eyes would open in the darkness. The end would come in one hot flare of pain as it walloped his head off his shoulder. The dark was stuffed with sound, all of them magnified and echoing. He could hear his friends snuffling along behind him, sometimes muttering something. There were gurglings and strange clinking groans. Once a flood of sizzling warm water washed past and between his legs, wetting him to the thighs and rocking him back on his heels. He felt Eddie clutch frantically at the back of his shirt, and then the small flood second from the end of the line, which he bellowed with sorry good humor. I think we just been pissed on by the jolly green giant, Bill. Bill could hear water or sewage running in controlled bursts through the network of smaller pipes, which now must be over their heads. He remembered the conversation about dairy sewers with his father, and thought he knew what this pipe must have been. It was to handle the overflow that only occurred during heavy rains and during the flood seasons. The stuff up there would be leaving dairy to be dumped in turbulent streams and the Penobscot River. The city didn't like to pump its shit into the Kensick because it made the canal stink, but all the so-called gray water went to the Kensick, and if there was too much for the regular sewer pipe to handle, there would be a dump off, like the one that had just happened. If there had been one, there would be another. He glanced up uneasily, not able to see anything, but knowing that there must be gates in the top arch of the pipe, possibly in the sides as well, and at that any moment there might be. It wasn't aware he'd reached the end of the pipe until he fell out of it and staggered forward, pinwheeling his arms in a helpless effort to keep his balance. He fell on his belly into a semi-cold, solid mass about 2 feet below the mouth of the pipe. He just tumbled out of something ran squeaking over his head. He screamed and sat up, clenching his tingling hand to his chest, aware that a rat had just run over it. He had felt the loathsome, planted drag of the thing's hairless tail. He tried to stand up and rapped his head on the new pipe's low ceiling. It was a hard hit, and Bill was driven back to his knees with large red flowers exploding in the darkness before his eyes. Be careful, he heard himself shouting. His words echoed flatly. It drops off here, Eddie. Where are you? Here. One of Eddie's waving hands brushed Bill's nose. Help me out, Bill. I can't see. There was a huge watery crash. Beverly, Mike, and Richie all screamed in unison in the daylight. The almost perfect harmony the three of them made would have been funny. Down here in the dark, in the sewers, it was terrifying, and suddenly all of them were trembling out. Bill clutched Eddie in a bear hug, trying to save his arms. Oh, Christ, I thought I was gonna drown, Richie moaned. We got doused. Oh, boy, a shit shower. Oh, great. They out to have a class trip down here sometime. Bill, we could get Mr. Carson to lead it, and Miss Jimenez could give a health lecture afterward, Ben said in a trembling voice, and they all laughed shrilly. As the laughter was tapering off, Stan suddenly burst into miserable tears. Don't, man, Richie said, putting a fumbling arm around Stan's sticky shoulders. You'll get us all crying, man. I'm all right, Stan said loudly, still crying. I can stand to be scared, but I hate being dirty like this. I hate not knowing where I am. Do you think any of the matches are still any good? Bill asked Richie. I gave mine to Bev. Bill felt a hand touch his in the darkness and pressed a folder of matches into it. They felt dry. I kept them in my armpit, she said. They might work. You can try them anyway. Bill tore a match out of the folder and struck it. It popped all alight, and he held it up. His friends were huddled together, wincing at the brief, bright flare of light. They were splashed, daubed with ordure, and they all looked very young and very afraid. Behind them, he could see the sewer pipe they had come out of. The pipe they were in was smaller still. It ran straight in both directions, its floor caked with layers of filthy sediments, and he drew in a quick hiss and shook the match out of its burnt his fingers. He listened and heard the sounds of fast running water, dripping water, the occasional gush and roar as the overflow valves worked, sending more sewage into the Kanzak, which was now God only knew how far behind them. He didn't hear Henry and the others yet. He said quietly, There's a dead body on my right about 10 feet away from us. I think it might be Patrick, Beverly asked, her voice trembling on the edge of hysteria. Is it Patrick Hawksgetter? Yes. Do you want me to light another match? Eddie said, You got to, Bill. If I don't see how the pipe runs, I don't know which way to go. Bill lit the match, and it glowed. They all saw the green swelled thing that had been Patrick Hawksgetter. The corpse grinned at them in the dark with horrid crumminess, but with only half a face. Sewer rats had taken the rest of Patrick's summer school books, were scattered around him, bloated to the size of dictionaries in the damp. Christ, Mike said hoarsely, his eyes wide. I hear them again, Beverly said. Henry and the others, the acoustics, must have carried her voice to them as well. Henry bellowed down the sewer pipe, and for a moment it was as if he was standing right here. We'll get you. You come on right ahead, Richie shouted, his eyes bright, dancing ferbally. Keep counting, Banana Heels. This is just like the YMCA swimming pool down here. Keep. Then a shriek of such mad fear and pain came through the pipe that the guttering match fell from Bill's fingers and went out. Eddie's arm had curled around him, and Bill hugged Eddie back, feeling his body trembling like a wire as Stan Uris packed close to him on the other side. That shriek rose and rose, and then there was an obscene, thick flapping noise, and the string was cut off. Something got one of them. Mike choked, horrified. In the darkness, some monster. Bill, we got to get out of here, please. Bill could hear whoever was left, one or two. With the acoustics, it was impossible to tell, stumbling and scrambling through the sewer pipe toward them. Which way, Eddie, he asked urgently. Do you know? Toward the canal, Eddie asked, shaking in Bill's arm. Yes, to the right, past Patrick. Or over him, Eddie's voice suddenly hardened. I don't care that much. He was one of the ones that broke my arm, spit in my face too. Let's go, Bill said, looking back at the sewer pipe. They had just quitted. Single line. Keep a touch on each other like before. He groped forward, dragging his right shoulder along the slimy porcelain surface of the pipe, gritting his teeth, not wanting to step on Patrick or into him. So they crawled farther into the darkness while waters rushed around them, and while outside the storm, walked and talked, and brought an early darkness to Derry, a darkness that screamed with wind and stutter with electric fire, and racket with fallen trees that sounded like the death cries of huge petrified creatures. Free. It. May 1985. Now they were coming again, and while everything had gone much as it had foreseen, something it had not foreseen had returned. That maddening gallon fear, that sense of another. It hated the fear would have turned on it and eaten it if it could have, but the fear danced mockingly out of reach, and it could only kill the fear by killing them. Surely there was no need for such fear. They were older now, and their number had been reduced from 7 to 5. 5 was a number of power, but it did not have the mystical telemistic quality of 7. It was true that its dog's body hadn't been able to kill the librarian, but the librarian would die in the hospital. Later, just before dawn touched the sky, it would send a male nurse with a bad pill habit to finish the librarian once and for all. The writer's woman was now with it, alive yet not alive. Her mind had been utterly destroyed by her first sight of it as it really was, with all of its little masks and glamours thrown aside, and all of them glamours were only mirrors, of course, thrown back at the terrified viewer. The worst thing in his or her own mind. Photographic images, as a mirror may bounce a reflection of the sun into a wide, unexpected eye and stunned it to blindness. Now the mind of the writer's wife was with it, in it beyond the end of the microverse, in the darkness beyond the turtle, in the outlands beyond all lands. She was in its eyes, she was in its mind, she was in the deadlights. Oh, but the glamours were amusing. Helen, for instance, he would not remember, not conditionally, but his mother could have told him where the bird he had seen at the ironworks came from. When he was a baby, only 6 months old, his mother had left him sleeping in his cradle in the side yard while she went around back to hang sheets and diapers on the line. His screams had brought her on the run. A large crow had lighted on the edge of the carriage and was pecking at baby Mikey like an evil creature in a nursery tale. He had been screaming in pain and terror, unable to drive away the crow which had sensed weak prey. She had struck the bird with her fists and driven it off. See that it had brought blood in 2 or 3 places on baby Mikey's arm, and take him to Dr. Stillwagon for a tentative shot. A part of Mike had remembered that always tiny baby, giant bird. When it came to Mike had seen the giant bird again. But when the dog's body, husband of the girl from before, brought the writer's woman, it had put on no face. It did not dress when it was at home. The dog's body husband had looked once and had dropped dead of shock, his face grayed, his eyes filling with the blood that had squirted out of his brain in a dozen places. The writer's woman had put out one powerful, horrified thought. Oh, dear Jesus, it is a female! And then all thoughts creased. She swung in the deadlights. It came down from its place and took care of her physical remains prepared from her for later feeding. Now Audrey Deborah hung high up in the middle of things, crisscrossed in silk, her head loying against the socket of her shoulder, her eyes wide and glazed, her toes pointing down. but there was still power in them. Dimensions, but still there. They had come here as children, and somehow against all the odds, against all that was supposed to be, all that could be, they had hurt it badly, had almost killed it, had forced it to flee deep into the earth, where it hundred, hurt and hated and trembling in the spreading pool of its own strange blood. So another new thing, if you please, for the first time in its never-ending history, it needed to make a plan for the first time. It found itself afraid simply to take what it wanted from Derry, its private game presence. It had always fed well on children. Many adults could be used without knowing they had been used, and it had never fed on a few of the older ones over the years. Adults had their own terrors, and their glands could be taped open so that all the chemicals of fear flooded the body and salted the meat. But their fears were mostly too complex. The fears of children were simply and usually more powerful. The fears of children could often he summit up in a single face. And if bait were needed, why, what child did not love a clown? It understood vaguely that these children had somehow turned its own tools against it, that by coincidence, surely not on purpose, surely not guided by the hand of any other, by the bonding of 7 extraordinary imaginative minds, it had been brought into a zone of great danger. Any of these 7 alone would have been its meat and drink, and if they had not happened to come together, it surely would have picked them off one by one, drawn by the quality of their minds, just as a line might be drawn to one particular water hole by the secret of zebra. But together they had discovered an alarm secret that even it had not been aware of, that believed has a second edge. If there are 10,000 medieval prisons who created vampires by believing them real, there may be one, probably a child, who will imagine the stake necessary to kill it. But a stake is only a stupid wood. The mind is the mallet which drives it home. Yet, in the end, it had escaped, had gone deep, and the exhausted, terrified children had elected not to follow it. When it was at its most vulnerable, they had elected to believe it dead or dying, and had retreated. It was aware of their oath, and had known they would come back just as a lion knows the zebra will eventually return to the waterhole. It had begun to plan, even as it began to drowse. When it woke, it would be healed, renewed, but their childhoods would be burned away like 7 fatty candles. The former power of their imagination would be muted and weak. They would no longer imagine that there were piranha in the Kinzig, or that if you stepped on a crack, you might really break your mother's back, or that if you killed a ladybug which lit on your shirt, your house would catch fire that night. Instead, they would believe in the entrance. Instead, they would believe in wine with dinner, something nice, but not too pretentious, like plowy verses 83, and let that breathe. Waiter, would you? Instead, they would believe that Ronalds caused you 47 times their own weight in stomach acid. Instead, they would believe in public television. Gary Hart, running in to prevent heart attacks, giving up red meat to prevent colon cancer. They would believe in Dr. Roof when it came to getting well fucked, and Jerry Falwell when it came to getting well saved, as each year passed their dreams would grow smaller, and when it woke it would call them back. Yes, back because fear was rental. Its child was rage, and rage cried for revenge. It would call them, and then kill them. Only now that they were coming, the fear had returned. They had grown up, and their imaginations had weakened, but not as much as it might be believed in. It had felt an ominous, upsetting growth in their power when they joined together, and it had wondered for the first time if it had perhaps made a mistake. But why be gloomy? The die was cast, and not all the omens were bad. The writer was half mad for his wife, and that was good. The writer was the strongest, the one who had somehow trained his mind for his confirmation over all the years. And when the writer was dead, with his guts fallen out of his body, when their precious Big Bill was dead, the others would be in its quickly. It would feed well, and then perhaps it would go deep again and doze for a while. 4. In the tunnels, 4:30 a.m. Bill, Richie shouted into the echoing pipe. He was moving as fast as he could, but that wasn't very fast. He remembered that as a kid, they had walked bent over in this pipe, which led away from the pumping station in the barriers. He was crawling now, and the pipe seemed impossibly tight. His glasses kept wanting to slide off the end of his nose, and he kept pushing them up again. He could hear Bev and Ben behind him. Bill, he bawled again. Eddie, I'm here. Eddie's voice floated back. Where's Bill? Richie shouted. Up ahead, Eddie called. He was very close now, and Richie sensed rather than saw him just ahead. He wouldn't wait. Richie's head butted Eddie's leg. A moment later, Bev's head butted Richie's ass. Bill, Richie screamed at the top of his voice. The pipe cancelled his shout and sent it back at him, heard in his own ears. Bill, wait for us. We have to go together. Don't you know that? Faintly echoing Bill. Audra, where are you? God damn you, Big Bill, Richie cried softly. His glasses fell off. He cursed, groped for them, and set them dripping back on his nose. He pulled in breath and shouted again. You'll get lost without Eddie, you fucking asshole. Wait up for us. You hear me, Bill? Wait up for us, god damn it. Wait was an antagonist moment of silence. It seems that no one breathed. All Richie could hear were distant, dripping water. The drain was dry this time, except for the occasional strantic puddle. Bill, he ran a trembling hand through his hair and fought the tears. Come on, Bill. Please, man, wait up. Please. And fainter still, Bill's voice came back. I'm waiting. Thank God for small favors, Richie muttered. He slapped Eddie's can. Go. I don't know how long I can with just one arm, Eddie said apologetically. Go anyway, Richie said, and Eddie began crawling again. Bill, looking haggard and almost used up, was waiting for them in the sewer shaft where the free pipes were lined up like lenses on dead traffic light. There was room enough here for them to stand up over there. Bill said, Chris and Belch. They looked. Beverly moaned, and Ben put an arm around her. The skeleton of Belch's Huggins, clad in moddery rags, seemed more or less interest. What remained of Victor was headless. Bill looked across the shaftway and saw a grinning skull. There was the rest of him. Should have left him alone, guys. Bill fought and shivered. This section of the sewer system had fallen into disgust. Richie thought the reason why was pretty clear. The waste treatment plant had taken over sometime during the years when they were all busy learning to shave, to drive, to smoke, to fuck around a little, all that good shit. The Environmental Protection Antagonist had come into being, and the EPA had decided dumping raw sewage and even gray water into rivers and streams was a no-no. So this part of the sewer system had simply moderated, and the bodies of Victor, Chris, and Belch Huggins had moderated along with it. Like Peter Pan's wild boys, Victor and Belch had never grown up. Here were the skeletons of two boys in the shredder and remains of t-shirts and jeans that had rotten away to rags. Moss had grown over the warp xylophone of Victor's ribcage and over the eagle on the buckle of his crimson belt. Monsters got him, Ben said softly. Do you remember We heard it happen. Audrey's dead, Bill's voice was mechanical. I know it. You don't know any such thing, Beverly said with such fury that Bill stirred and looked at her. Bill, you know for sure is that a lot of other people have died, most of them children. She walked across to him and stood before him with her hands on her hips. Her face and hands were streaked with grim. Her hair matted with dirt. Richie thought she looked absolutely magnificent. And you know what did it. I never should have told you where I was going, Bill said. Why did I do that? Why did I... Her hands pisted out and seized him by the shirt. Amazed, Richie watched as she shook him. No more. You know what we came for. We swore and we're going to do it. Do you understand me, Bill? If she's dead, she's dead. But it's not. Now we need you. Do you get it? We need you. She was crying now. So you stand up for us. You stand up for us like before, or none of us are going to get out of here. He looked at her for a long time without speaking, and Richie found himself thinking, Come on, Big Bill. Come on, come on. Bill looked around at the rest of them and nodded. Eddie, I'm here, Bill. Do you still remember which pipe? Eddie pointed past Victor and said, That's the one. Looks pretty small, doesn't it? Bill nodded again. Can you do it? With your arm broken? I can for you, Bill. Bill smiled, the wariest, most terrible smile Richie had ever seen. Take us there, Eddie. Let's get it done. 5. In the tunnels. 4:55 a.m. As he crawled, Bill reminded himself of the drop-off at the end of his house pipe, but it still surprised him. At one moment, his hands were struffling along the crusted surface of the old pipe. At the next day, were skating on air. He pitched forward and rolled instinctively, landed on his shoulder with a painful crunch. Be careful, he heard himself shouting. Here's the jump off, Eddie. Here, one of Eddie's waving hands brushed across Bill's forehead. Can you help me out? He got his arm around Eddie and lifted him out, trying to be careful of the bad arm. Ben came next. Then Bev, then Richie. You got any matches, Richie? I do, Beverly said. Bill felt a hand touched his in the darkness and pressed a folder of matches into it. There's only 8 or 10, but Ben's got more from the one. Bill said, Did you keep him in your armpit, Bev? Not this time, she said, and put her arms around him. In the dark, he hunched her tight eyes closed, trying to take the comfort she wanted so badly to give. He released her gently and struck a match. The power of memory was great. They all looked at once to their right. What remained of Patrick Hawksketter's body was still there, armed a few lumpy, overgrown things that might have been books. The only really recognizable thing was a jutting semicircle of teeth, 2 or 3 of them with fillings, and something nearby, a gleaming circle barely seemed in a match guttering light. Bill shook the match out and lit another. He picked it up. Audrey's wedding ring, he said. His voice was hollow, expressionless. The match went out in his fingers. In the darkness, he put the ring on. Bill, Richie said hesitantly, do you have any idea? Any idea? 6. In the tunnels. 2:20 p.m. How long they had been wandering through the tunnels under Derry since they had left the place where Patrick Hawksketter's body was, but Bill was sure he could find his way back. He kept thinking about what his father had said. You could wander for weeks if Eddie's sense of direction failed them now. They wouldn't need it to kill them. They would wander until they died, or if they got into the wrong set of pipes until they were drowned like rats in a rain barrel. But Eddie didn't seem a bit worried. Every now and then he would ask Bill to light one of the Jimishon store of matches, look around thoughtfully, and then set off again. He made rights and left seemingly at random sometimes. The pipes were so big Bill could not reach their tops even by stretching his hand up all the way. Sometimes they had to crawl, and once for 5 horrible miniatures, which felt more like 5 hours. They worried their way along on their bellies. Eddie's now leaving, the others following with their noses to heels of the person ahead. The only thing Bill was completely sure of was that they had somehow gotten into a discussed section of the dairy sewer system. They had left all the activity pipes, either far behind or far above the roar of running water. I had dimed to a far-off thunder. These pipes were older, not kiln-fried ceramic, but a crumbly clay-like stuff that sometimes oozed a spring of unpleasant smell and fluid. The smells of the human waste, those ripe, gassy smells that had threatened to suffocate them all, had faded, but they had been replaced by another smell, yellow and agent, that was worse. Ben thought it was the smell of the mummy. To Eddie it smelled like the leper. Richie thought it smelled like the world's oldest flannel jacket, now moldery and rotty, a lumberman's jacket, a very big one, big enough for a character like Paul Bunyan. Perhaps to Beverly it smelled like her father's sock drawer. In Stan Ersk's it woke a dreadful memory from his earliest childhood, an oddly Jewish memory in a boy who had only the hastiest understanding of his own Jewishness. It smelled like clay mixed with oil and made him think of an eyeless, mouthless demon called the Golem, a claimant that re-engendered Jews were supposed to have raised in the Middle Ages to save them from the Goyim who robbed them and raped their women and then sent from packing. Mike thought of the dry smell of father's feathers in a dead nest. When they finally reached the end of the narrow pipe, they slivered like eels the curved surface of another which ran at an optical angle to the one they had been in, and found they could stand up again. Bill felt the heads of the matches left in the buck, for his mouth tightened, and he resolved not to tell the others how close they were to the end of their light, not unless he absolutely had to. "How you guys doing?" They murmured replies, and he nodded in the dark. No panic and no tears. Said Stan's that was good. He felt for their hands, and they stood together in the dark that way for a while, both taken and given from the touch. Bill felt clear exhalation in this, a sure sense, but that they were somehow producing more than the sum of their 7 shelves. They had been re-added into a more potent whole. He lit one of the remaining matches, and they saw a narrow tunnel stretching ahead on a downward slant. The top of this pipe was festooned with saggy cobwebs, some water broken and hanging in shrouds. Looking at them gave Bill a testificant chill. The floor here was dry but thick with ancient mold, and what might have been leaves, fungus, or some unimaginable droppings. Farther up he saw a pile of bones and a drift of green rags. They might once have been that stuff they called polished cotton, workmen's clothes. Bill imagined some sewer department or water department worker who had gotten lost, wandered down here, and been discovered. The match guttered. He tipped its head downward, wanting the light to last a little longer. "Do you know where we are?" he asked Eddie. Eddie pointed down the slightly crooked bore of the tunnel. "Canal's that way," he said, "less than a half a mile, unless this thing turns in a different direction. We're under Up Mile Hill right now, I think, but Bill..." The match burned Bill's finger and let it drop. They were in darkness again. Somehow Bill thought it was Beverly's side, but before the match had gone out, he had seen the worry on Eddie's face. What is it? When I say we're under Up Mile Hill, I mean we're really under it. We've been going down for a long time now. Nobody'd ever put sewer pipes in this deep. When you put a tunnel this deep, you call it a mine shaft. How did you do a figure we are, Eddie, Richie asked. 1/4 of a mile, Eddie said, maybe more. Jesus, please us, Beverly said. These aren't sewer pipes anyway, Stan said from behind them. You could tell by that smell. It's bad, but it's not a sewery smell. I think I'd rather smell the sewer, Ben said. It smells like a scream floating down to them, issuing from the mouth of the pipe they had just left, lifting their hair on the nape of Bill's neck. The 7 of them drew together, clutching each other. Gonna get you, son of a bitches. We're gonna get you. Henry, Eddie breathed. Oh my God, he's still coming. I'm not surprised, Richie said. Some people are too stupid to quit. They could hear faint painting, the scrape of shoes, the whisper of clove. You. Come on, Bill said. They started down the pipe, now walking double except for Mike, who was at the back of the line. Bill and Eddie, Richie and Bev, and Ben and Stan. How far back do you think Henry is? I couldn't tell, Big Bill, Eddie said. The echoes are bad. He dropped his voice. Did you see that pipe of bones? Yes, Bill said, dropping his own voice. There was a tool belt with the clothes. I think it was a water department guy. I guess so. How long you think? I don't know. Eddie closed his good hand over Bill's arm in the darkness. It was perhaps 15 minutes later when they heard something coming towards them in the dark. Richie stopped, frozen cold all the way through. Suddenly he was 3 years old again. He listened to that squelching, shifting movement, closing in on them, closing, and to the whisper branch like sounds that complicated it. And even before Bill struck the match, he knew what it would be. The eye, he screamed. Christ, it's the crawling eye. For a moment, the others were not sure what they were seeing. Beverly had an impression that her father had found her, even down here, and Eddie had a fleeting version of Patrick Hawkscutter come back to life. Somehow Patrick had flanked them and gotten in front of them, but Richie's cry, Richie's certainty, froze the shape for all of them. They saw what Richie saw. A gigantic filled the tunnel, the glassy black pupil 2 feet across the iris in a muddy recess color, the white, bludgy membranous, laced with red veins that pulsed steadily. It was a lidness, lashness, glintiness horror that moved on a bed of raw-looking tentacles. These fumbled over the tunnels, crumbling, surface and sank in it like fingers, so that the impression given in the glow of Bill's guttery match was of an eye that had somehow grown nightmare fingers which were pulling it along. It stared at him with blank, feverish avarice. The match went out. In the darkness, Bill felt those branch-like tentacles caress his ankles and shins, but he could not move. His body was frozen solid. It sensed it approaching. It could feel the heat radiating out from it. It could hear the wet pulse of blood wetting its membranes. He imagined the sickness he would feel when it touched him, and still he could not scream, even when fresh tentacles slipped around his waist and hooked themselves into the loops of his jeans and began to drag him forward. He could not scream or struggle. A deadly sleepiness seemed to have suffused his whole body. Beverly felt one of the tentacles slip around the cup of her ear and suddenly draw noose tight. Pain flared, and she was dragged forward, twisting, moaning, as if an old lady school teacher were giving her in out of practice. Come along to the back of the room, where she would be forced to sit on a stool, and where a Dunsincat, Stan, and Richie tried to back away, but a forest of unseen tentacles now was verted and whispered about them. Ben put an arm around Beverly and tried to tug her back. She clasped his hand with panic and tightness. Ben, it's gone. It's got me. No, it don't. Wait, I'll pull. He pulled with all his might, and Beverly screamed as pain tore through her ear and blood began to flow. A tentacle, dry and hard, draped over Ben's shirt, paused, then twisted in a painful knot around his shoulder. Bill put out a hand and slapped into a gluey, yielding wetness. The eye, his mind screamed. Oh, God, I have my hand in the eye. Oh, God, oh, dear sweet God, the eye, my hand in the eye. He began to fight now, but the tentacles drew him forward incessantly. His hand disappeared into that wet avant heat. His forearm, now his arm, was plunged into the eye to the elbow, At any moment, the rest of his body would come against that sticky surface, and he felt that he would go mad in that instant. He fought faintly, chopping at the tentacles with his other hand. Eddie stood like a boy in a dream, hearing the muffled screams and sounds of struggle as his friends were being pulled in. He sensed the tentacles around him, but not had as yet actually landed on him. "Run home," his mind commanded him quietly, loudly. "Run home to your mama, Eddie. You can find the way." Bill screamed in the dark, a high, despairing sound that was followed by hideous squishing and slobberings. Eddie's paralyzed broken wide open. It was trying to take Big Bill. "No," Eddie bellowed. It was a full-blown roar. What might never have guessed such a Norse warrior sound could issue from such a thin chest. Eddie's Casbrack's lungs, which were, of course, afflicted with the most terrible case of asthma and dairy. He bolted forward, jumping over questioning tentacles without seeing them, his broken arm thumping his own chest as it swung back and forth in its soggy cast. He fumbled in his pockets and brought out his aspartame. Acid, that what it tastes like. Acid, battery acid. He clawed it with Bill's Deprogue's back and slammed him aside. There was a watery, ripping sound followed by a low, eager mewing that Eddie did not so much hear with his ears as he feel with his mind. He raised the aspartame. "Acid, it's acid. If I want it to be. So eat it. He battery acid. Fuck nuts!" Eddie screamed and triggered off a blast. At the same time, he kicked at the eye. His foot went deep into the jelly of its corner. There was a gush of hot fluid over his legs. He pulled his foot back, only dimly aware that he had lost his shoe. "Fuck off, cram it, Sam. Go away, Jose. Get lost. Fuck off." He felt tentacles touch him, but tenderly. He triggered the aspartame again, code in the eye, and felt/heard that million again. Now a hurt, surprised sound. "Fight it," Eddie raved at the others. "It's just a fucking eye. Fight it, you hear me? Fight it, Bill. Kick the shit out of that sucker. Jesus Christ, you fucking pussies. I'm doing the mashed potatoes all over it. And I got a broken arm." Bill felt his strength return. He ripped his dripping arm out of the eye and then slammed it. First, backed it a moment later. Ben was beside him. He ran into the eye, grunting with surprise and disgust, and then began to rain punching onto its jellied, quivering surface. "Let her go," he yelled. "You hear me? Let her go. We gotta, get out of here. Get out of here. Just an eye. Just a fucking eye," Eddie was screaming. Earnestly, he triggered his aspartame again, and through it drew back. The tentacles, which had settled on him now, dropped away. Richie, get it. It's just an eye." Richie stumbled forward, unable to believe he was doing this, actually approaching the worst, most terrible monster in the world. But he only threw a single weak punch, and the feel of his fist sinking into the eye. It was thick and wet, somehow gristly, made him throw his guts up in one big, tasteless convulsion. A sound came out of him. Glurt! And the thought that he'd actually puke on the eye caused him to do it again. It was only a single punch, but since he had created this particular monster, perhaps that was all that was necessary. Suddenly the tentacles were gone. They could hear it withdrawing, and then the only sound were Eddie panting and Beverly crying softly, one hand to her bleeding ear. Bill struck one of their 3 remaining matches, and they started at each other with dazed, shocked faces. Bill's left arm was running with a thick, cloudy goo that looked like a mixture of particularly congealed egg white and snot. Blood was trickling slowly down the side of Beverly's neck, and there was a fresh cut on Ben's cheek. Richie slowly pushed his glasses up on his nose. We all right?" Bill asked hoarsely. "Are you Bill?" Richie asked. "Yeah." He turned to Eddie and hugged the smaller boy with fierce intensity. "You saved my life, man." "I ate your shoe," Beverly said, in an utterly wild laugh. "Isn't it that too bad? I'll buy you a new pair of Kens when we get out of here," Richie said. He clapped Eddie on the back in the dark. "How did you do it, Eddie?" "Shot it with my aspartame," Pretend it was acid. That's how it tastes after a while. If I'm having, a bad day. Worked great. I'm doing the mashed potatoes all over it, and I got a broken arm. Arm, Richie said and giggled madly. Not too shabby, Eds. Actually pretty chuckleistic, I'll tell you what. I hate it when you call me Eds. I know, Richie said, hugging him tightly, but somebody has to toughen you up, Eds. When you stop leading the shelter existence of a child and grow up, you gotta, I say, you gonna find out life ain't always this easy, boy. Eddie began to shrink with laughter. That's the shittiest voice I ever heard, Richie. Well, keep that aspartame thing handy, Beverly said. We might need it again. You didn't see it anywhere, Mike asked. When it lit the match, it's gone, Bill said, and then added grimly. But we're getting close to it, to the place where it stays. And I think we hit that time. Henry's still coming, Stan said. His voice was low and hoarse. I can hear him back there. Then let's move out, Ben said. They did. The tunnel processed steadily downward, and that smell, that low, wild stretch grew steadily along stronger. At times they could hear Henry behind them, but now his cries seemed far away and not at all important. There was a feeling in all of them similar, not that feeling of skews and disconnection they had felt in the house on Neobold Street, that they had processed over the edge of the world and into some queer nothingness. Bill felt, although he did not have the vocabulary to express what he knew, that they were approaching Derry's dark and ruined heart. It seemed to Mike Hanlon that he could almost feel that heart's distance. Armamatic beat. Beverly felt a sense of evil power growing around her, seeming to enfold her, certainly trying to split her off from the others to make her alone. Nervously, she reached out on either side of herself and clasped Bill's hand and Ben's. It seemed to her that she had to reach too far, and she called out nervously, Hang on to hands. It's like we're moving away from each other. It was Stan who first realized he could see again. There was a low, strange radiance in the air. At first, he could only see hands, his Clapson's Ben on one side and Mike's on the other. Then he realized he could see the buttons on Richie's muddy shirt and the Captain Midnight ring, just some chunky cereal box prize that Eddie liked to wear on his little finger. Can you guys see? Stan asked, coming to a stop. The others stopped too. Bill looked around, first aware that he could see a little anyway, and then that the tunnel had widened out amazingly. They were now in a curved chambers, easily as big as the summer tunnel in Boston. Bigger, he amended, as he looked around with a growing sense of awe. They craned their necks back to see the ceiling, which was now 50 feet or more above them and held up by outcurve and buttress of stone like ribs. Nets of dirty cobweb hung between them. The floor was now stone-flagged, but overlaid with such a drift of aged dirt that the quality of their footfalls had never changed. The upcurving walls were easily 50 feet away on either side. Waterworks must have really gone crazy down there, Richie said, and laughed uneasily. Looks like a cafeteria, Beverly said softly. Where's the light coming from? Ben wanted to know. Coming right out of the wall, looks like, Bill said. I don't like it, Stan said. Let's go. Henry will be breathing down our necks. A loud brain cry split the gloom, and then ruffling heavy under the wings, a shape came cursing out of the dark, one eye glaring. The other was a dark lamp. The bird, Stan screamed. Look out, it's the bird. It dived at them like an absent fighter plane, its plain orange beak opened and closing to reveal the pink inner lining of its mouth, plushed as a sainted pillow in a coffin. It went straight for Eddie, its beak raked with shoulder, and he felt pain sink into his flesh like acid. Blood flowed down his chest. He cried out as the backwash of its blood flowed down his chest. He cried out as the backwash of its beaten wings blew noxious tunnel air in his face. It wheeled back, its eyes glaring malevolently, roll in its sockets, blurring only as its nicotine in the eyelid jittered down momentarily to cover the eye with tissue thin film. Its claws soughed to Eddie, who ducked screaming. They razored through the back of his shirt, cutting it open, drawing shallow scarlet lines along his shoulder blades. Eddie yelled and tried to crawl away, but the bird wheeled back again. Mike broke forward, digging in his pocket. He came out with a one-blade buck knife. As the bird dived on Eddie again, he swept it in a quick, tight arc across one of the bird's talons. It cut deep, and blood poured out. The bird banked away and then came back, folding its wing, diving in like a bullet. Mike fell to one side at the last moment, slashing upward with the buck knife. He missed, and the bird's claws hit his wrist with such force that his hand went numb and tingly. The bruises that later bloomed there went most of the way to his elbow. The buck flew into the dark. The bird came back, screeching trumpetedly, and Mike rolled his body over Eddie's and waited for the worst. Stan walked forward towards the two boys, huddled on the floor. As the bird returned, he stood small and somehow trimmed in spite of the dirt grimmed into his hands and arms and pants and shirt, and suddenly held his hands out in a curious gesture, palms up, fingers down. The bird uttered another squawk and sheered off, bulleted by Stan, missing him by inches, lifting his hair, and then dropping it in the buffeting wake in its passage. He turned in a tight circle to face its return. I believe in scarlet tigers, even though I never saw one, he found in a scarlet, clear voice. The bird screamed and blinked as if he'd shoot at it. Same with vultures and the new genuine mudlark and the flamingos of Brazil. The bird screamed, circled, and suddenly flew on up the tunnel, squawking. I believe in the gold-balled eagle, Stan screamed after it. And I think there really might be a phoenix somewhere. But I don't believe in you. So get the fuck out of here. Get out. Hit the road, Jack. He stopped then, and the silence seemed very large. Bill, Ben, and Beverly went to Mike and Eddie. They helped Eddie to his feet, and Bill looked at the cuts. Not deep, he said, but I bet they hurt like hell. I tore my shirts to pieces, Big Bill. Eddie's cheeks glinted with tears, and he was wheezing again. The Beloan barbarian's voice was gone. It was hard to believe it had ever been there. What am I going to tell my mom? Bill smiled a little. Why don't we worry about that when we get out of here? Give yourself a blast, Eddie. Eddie did, inhaling deeply and went wheezing. That was great, man, Richie told Stan. That was just frogging great. Stan was shivering all over. There's no birds like that. That's all. There never has been, and there never will be. We're coming, Henry screamed from behind them. His voice was utterly determined. He was laughing and howling now. He sounded like something that has crawled out of a crack in the roof of hell. Men belch, we're coming and we'll get you, you little punks. You can't get any away, Bill shouted. Get out, Henry, while there's still time. Henry's response was a howl, interpolated scream. They heard a hustle of footsteps, and in a burst of conspiration, Bill understood Henry's whole purpose. He was real. He was mortal. He could not be stopped by his inasperton or bird book. Magic would not work on Henry. He was too stupid. Come on. We gotta stay ahead of him. They went on again, holding hands. Eddie's tattered shirt flapping behind him. The light grew brighter, the tunnel even ever huger. As it canted downward, the ceiling flew away above until they could barely see it. It now seemed to them that they were not walking in a tunnel at all, but making their way through a titanic underground country yard. They approached to some cyclopean castle. The light from the walls had become a running green-yellow fire. The smell was stronger, and they began to pick up a vibration that might have been real or might have been only in their minds. It was steady and rhythmic. It was a heartbeat. It ends up ahead, Beverly cried. Look, it's a blank wall. But as they drew closer, ant-like now, on this great floor of dirty stone blocks, each block bigger than Basie Park, it seems they saw that the wall was not entirely blank after all. It was broken by a single door. and although the wall itself towered hundreds of feet above them, the door was very small. It was no more than 3 feet high, a door of the sort you might see in a fairy tale book, made of stout oaken boards, bound with iron strips in an X pattern. It was, they all realized at once, a door made only for children. Ghostly in his mind, Ben heard the librarian reading to the little ones. "Who is that trip-trapping upon my bridge?" The children leaned forward. All the old fascinations glistened in their eyes. Will the monsters be bested, or will it feed? There was a mark on the door, and heaped at its foot was a pile of bones. Small bones. The bones of God alone knew how many children they had come to place of it. The mark of the door then. What was that? Bill marked it as a paper boat. Stan saw it was as a bird rising towards the sky. A phoenix, perhaps. Michael saw a hooded figure, that of crazy Butch Bowers, perhaps. If it could only be seen. Richie saw 2 eyes behind a pair of spectacles. Beverly saw a hand doubled up into a fist. Eddie believed it to be the face of the leper, all sunken eyes and wrinkled snarled mouth. All disease, all sickness was stamped into that face. Ben Hanscom saw a tattered pile of wrappings and seemed to smell old sour pieces. Later, arriving at that same door, with Belch's scream still echoing in his ears, alone at the end of it, Henry Bowers would see it as the moon full ripe and black. "I'm scared, Bill," Ben said in a wavery voice. "Do we have to?" Bill towed the bones and suddenly scattered them in a powder and riddle drift with 1 foot. He was scared too, but there was George to consider. It had ripped off George's arm. Were those small and fragile bones among these? Yes, of course they were. They were here for the owners of the bones, George and all the others, those who had been brought here, those who might be brought here, those who had been left in other places simply to rot. "We have to," Bill said. "What if it's locked?" Beverly asked in a small voice. "It's not locked," Bill said, and then told her what he knew from deeper inside. Cases like these are never locked. He placed the tented figures of his right hand on the door and pushed. It swung open on a flood of sick yellow-green light. That zoo smelled wafted out at them, incredibly strong, incredibly potent now. One by one, they passed through the fairy tale door into the lair of it. 7 in the tunnels, 4:59 a.m. Bill stopped so suddenly that the others piled up like freight cars when the engine suddenly comes to a panic stop. "What is it?" Ben called. "It is, we're here, the eye. Do you remember?" "I remember," Richie said. Eddie stopped it with his aspartame. By Eddie, it was Asic. He said something about some dance. Pretty calculants, but I can't remember exactly what it was. "It doesn't matter. We won't see anything we saw before," Bill said. He struck the light and looked around at the others. Their faces were luminous in the glow of the match, luminous and mysterious, and they seemed very young. "How you guys doing?" "We're okay, Big Bill," Eddie said, but his face was drawn with pain. Bill's makeshift splint was coming apart. "How about you?" "Okay," Bill said, and shook out the match before his face. Could tell them any different story. "How did it happen?" Beverly asked him, touching his arm in the dark. "Bill, how could she?" "Because I mentioned the name of the town. She came after me, even when I was doing it. Something inside was telling me to shut up, but I didn't listen." He shook his head helplessly in the dark. "But even if she came to Derry, I don't understand how she could have gotten down here. If Henry didn't bring her, then who did?" "It," Ben said. "It doesn't have to look bad. We know that. It could have shown up and said you were in trouble, taken her here in order to fuck you up. I suppose to kill our guts. 'Cause that's what you always were, Big Bill. Our guts. Tom, Beverly said in a low voice, almost a musing voice. Who? Bill struck another match. She was looking at him with a kind of depressed honesty. Tom, my husband. He knew, too. At least I think I mentioned the name of the town to him. The way you mentioned to Audrey, I don't know if it took or not. He was pretty angry with me at the time. Jesus, what is this? Some kind of soap opera where everyone turns up sooner or later, Richie said. Not a soap opera, Bill said, sounding sick. A show like the circus. Bev here went and married Henry Bowers when she left. Why wouldn't he come here? After all, the real Henry did. No, Beverly said. I didn't marry Henry. I married my father. If he beat on you, what's the difference? Eddie asked. Come around me, Bill said. Move in. They did. Bill reached out of the eater's side and found Eddie's good hand and one of Richie's soon. Soon they stood in a circle, as they had done once before, when their number was greater. Eddie felt someone put an arm around his shoulders. The feeling was warm and comforting and deeply familiar. Bill felt the sense of power that he remembered from before, but understood with some depressionation that things really had changed. The power was nowhere near as strong. It struggled and flickered like a candle flame in foul air. The darkness seemed thicker and closer to them before trumpeting, and he could smell it. Down this passageway, he thought, and not so terribly far, is a door with a mark on it. What was behind that door? It's the one thing I still can't remember. I can remember making my fingers stiff because they wanted to tremble, and I can remember pushing the door open. I can even remember the flood of light that streamed out and how it seemed almost alive, as if it wasn't just light, but flower and snakes. I remember the smell like the monkey house in a big zoo, but even worse, and then nothing. Do any of you remember what it really was? No, Eddie said. I think, Richie began, and then Bill could almost feel him shake his head in the dark. No, Beverly said. That was Ben. That's the one thing I still can't remember. What it was, or how we fought it. Chud, Beverly said. That's how we fought it. But I don't remember what that means. Stand by me, Bill said, and I'll stand by you guys. Bill, Ben said. His voice was very calm. Something is coming. Bill listened. He heard dragged, scrambling footsteps approaching them in the dark, and he was afraid. Audrey, he called, and knew already that it was not her. Whenever it was stumbling towards them, drew closer. Bill struck the light. 8. Derry. 5 a.m. The first wrong thing happened on the late spring day in 1985, 2 minutes before official sunrise. To understand how wrong it was, one would have to have known two facts that were known to Mike Hanlon, who lay unconscious in the Derry Hospital as the sun came up. Both concerning the Grace Baptist Church, which had stood on the corner of Witcham and Jackson since 1897. The church was topped with a slender white spire, which was the appurtenance of every Protestant church steeple in New England. There were clock faces on all four sides of the steeple base, and the clock itself had been constructed and shipped from Switzerland in the year 1898. The only one like it stood in the town square of Havens Village, 40 miles away. Stephen Bowie, a timber baron who lived on West Broadway, donated the clock to the town at the cost of some $17,000. Bowie could afford it. He was a devout church ogre and deacon for 40 years. During several of those later years, he was also president of Derry's Legion of White Dickinson chapters. In addition, he was known for his devout layman's sermons on Mother's Day, which he always referred to virtually as Mother's Sunday, from the time of its installation until May 31st, 1985. That clock had faithfully chimed each hour and each half, with one notable explanation. On the day of the explosion at the Kitchener Ironworks, it had not chimed the noon hour. Residents believed that the reserve Jollinan had silenced the clock to show that the church was in mourning for the dead children, and Jollinan never disabused then of this notice, although it was not true. The clock had simply not chimed, nor did it chime the hour of 5 on the morning of May 31st, 1985. At that moment, all over Derry, old-timers opened their eyes and sat up disturbed for no reason they could not put their fingers on. Medicines were gulped, felched teeth put in, pipes and cigars lit. The old folks stood a watch. One of them was Norbert Need, now in 90s. He hobbled to the window and looked out at a darkened sky. The weather report the night before had called for clear skies, but his bones told him it was going to rain, and hard. He felt scared. Deep inside him, in some obscure way, he felt threatening, as if a poison were working its way relentlessly towards his heart. He thought randomly of the day the Bradley gang had ridden headlessly into Derry, into the sights of 25 pistols and rifles. That kind of work left a man feeling a kind of warm and lazy inside, like everything was somehow confirmed. He couldn't put it anywhere better than that, even to himself. Work like that left a man feeling like he maybe might live forever. And Norbert Need damn near had 96 years old come June 24th, and he still walked 3 miles every day. But how he felt scared. Those kids, he said, looking out of his window, unaware he had spoken. What is it with them damn kids? What they monkeying around with this time? Egbert threw out Good, 99, who had been in the Silver Dollar when Claude Horcrux tuned up his axe and played the Dead March for 4 men on it, awoke at the same moment, sat up, and let out a rusty scream that no one heard. He had dreamed of Claude, only Claude had been coming after him, and the axe had come down, and a moment after it did, Through Good had been his own servant, hand twitching and curling on the counter. Something wrong, he thought, in his muddy way, frightened and shaken all over in his pea-stained long johns. Something dreadful wrong. Dave Gardner, who had discovered George Depprogue's mutilated body in October of 1957, and whose son had discovered the first victim of this new cycle earlier in the spring, opened his eyes on the stroke of 5 and thought, even before looking at the clock on the brew. Grace Church clock didn't chime the hour. What's wrong? He felt a large, ill-defined fright. Dave had prospered over the years. In 1965, he had purchased a shoe boat, and now there was a second shoe boat at the Derry Mall, and a third up in Bangor. Suddenly, all of those things he had spent his life working for seemed in jeopardy. From what? He cried to himself, looking at his sleeping wife. From what? Why are you so goddamn anxious just because that clock didn't chime? But there was no answer. He got up and went to the window, hitching at the waistband of his pajamas. The sky was restless, with clouds racing in front of the west, and Dave's squint grew. For the first time in a very long while, he found himself thinking of the scream that had brought him to his porch 27 years ago. To see that riffing figure in the yellow rain slicker, he looked at the approaching clouds and thought, we're in danger, all of us, Derry. Chief Andrew Ranmarcher, who had believed he had tried his best to solve the new string of child murders that had plunged Derry, stood on the porch of his house. Phelps in the Sam Bowen belt, looking up at the clouds, and felt the same disquiet. Something getting ready to happen. Look like it's going to pour buckets, for one thing, but that's not all. He shuddered, and as he stood there on his porch, the smell of the bacon his wife was cooking, wafting out through the screen door. The first dime seas dropped. Rain darkened the sidewalk in front of his Pleasant Reynolds Street home, and somewhere just over the horizon from Bainsey Dark, thunder rumbled. Ranmarcher shivered. Again. 9. George. 5:01 a.m. Bill held the match up and uttered a long, trembling, despairing screech. It was George wavering up the tunnel toward him. George, still dressed in his blood-spattered yellow rain slicker. One sleeve dangled limp and useless. George's face was white as cheese, and his eyes were shiny silver. They fixed on Bill's own. My boat, Georgie's lost voice rose, wavering in the tunnel. I can't find it, Bill. I looked everywhere, and I can't find it. And now I'm dead. It's all your fault. Your fault. Your fault. Georgie Bill shrieked. He felt his mind totter and ripping free of its moorings. George stumbled, staggered toward him, and now his one remaining arm rose toward Bill, the white hand at the end of it hooked into a claw. The nails were dirty and grasping. Your fault, George whispered and grinned. His teeth were fangs. They opened and closed slowly, like the teeth in a bear trap. You sent me out, and it's all your fault. No, Georgie Bill cried. I didn't know. Kill you, George cried, and a mixture of dog-like sounds come out of that fanged mouth. Yips, yelps, howls, a kind of laughter. Bill could smell him now, could smell George Rawdon. It was a clear-turd smell, squirmer, the smell of some final monster standing slump, and yellow-eyed in a corner, waiting to unzip some small boy's guts. George's teeth gashed together. The sound was like billowing balls, clicking off one another. Yellow pus began to leak from his eyes and dribbled down his face, and the match went out. Bill felt his friends disappear. They were running, of course, they were. They were leaving him alone. They were cutting him off. His parents had cut him off, because George was right. It was his fault. Soon he could feel that single hand seize his throat. Soon he would feel those fangs pulling him open. And that would be right. That would be only just. He had sent George out to die, and he had spent his whole adult life writing about the horror of that betrayal. Oh, he had put many faces on it, almost as many faces as it, and had put on for their benefit. But the monster at the bottom of everything was only George, running out into the recescent flood with his paraffin-coated paper boat. Now would come to the atonement. You deserve to die for killing me, George whispered. He was very close now. Bill closed his eyes. Then yellow light splashed the tunnel, and he opened them. Richie was holding up a match. Fight it, Bill, Richie shouted. God's sake, fight it! What are you doing? He looked at them, bewildered. They hadn't run after all. How could that be? How could that be after they had seen how fully he had murdered his own brother? Fight it, Beverly was screaming. Oh, Bill, fight it. Only you can do this. Please. George was less than 5 feet away now. He suddenly stuck his tongue out at Bill. It was calling with white figurine growths. Bill screamed again. Kill it, Bill, Eddie shouted. That's not your brother. Kill it while it's small. Kill it now. George glanced at Eddie, cut in his shiny silver eyes that way for just a moment, and Eddie reeled back and struck the wall as if he had been pushed. Bill stood memorist, watching his brother come towards him. George again, after all these years. It was George at the end as it had been George at the beginning. Oh, yes, and he could hear the creak of George's yellow slicker as George closed the distance. He could hear the jingle of the buckles on his overshoes, and he could smell something like wet leaves, as if underneath the slicker. George's body was made of them, as if the feet inside George's galoshes were leaf feet. Yes, a leaf man. That was it. That was George. He was rotten balloon faces, in a body made of dead leaves, the kind that sometimes choke the sewers after a flood. Dimly he heard Beverly shrieked. He thrust his fist. Bill, please, Bill, against the post, and still insists. We'll look for my boat together, George said. Thick yellow pus-mock tears rolled down his cheek. He reached for Bill, and his head cocked sideward, his teeth peeling back from those fangs. He sees the ghosts, and he sees the ghosts. He sees. We'll find it, George said, and Bill could smell its breath, and it was a smell like exploding animals lying on the highway at midnight. As George's mouth yawned, he could see things squirming around inside there. It's still down there. Everything floats down here. We'll float, Bill. We all float. George's fish belly hand closed on Bill's neck. He sees the ghosts. We sees the ghosts. Then we see the ghosts. George's contorted face drifted toward Bill's neck. Float. He thrust his fist against the posts, Bill cried. His voice was deeper, hardly his own at all. In an searing flash of memory, Richie remembered that Bill only stuttered in his own voice when he pretended to be someone else. He never did. The George thing recoiled hissing, its hand going to its face in a wandering off gesture. That's it, Richie screamed, delirious. You got it, Bill. Get it. Get it. Get it. He thrust his fist against the post and still insists he sees the ghost. Bill thundered. He advanced on the George thing. You're no ghost, George knows. I didn't mean for him to die. My folks were wrong. They took it out on me. And that was wrong. Do you hear me? The George thing apparently turned squealing like a rat. It began to run and ripple under the yellow slicker. The slicker itself seemed to be dripping, running in bright blots of yellow. It was losing its shape, becoming abnormous. He thrust his fists against the post. You son of a bitch! Bill Deprogue screamed, and still insists he sees the ghost. He leaped at it, and his fingers snagged in the yellow rain slicker. That was no longer a rain slicker. What he grabbed felt like some strange warm taffy that melted under his fingers. As soon as he had reached his fists around it, he fell to his knees. Then Richie yelled as the gutter and match burned his fingers, and they were plunged into the darkness again. Bill felt something begin to grow in his chest, something hot and choking and as painful as fiery nettles. He gripped his knees and drew them up to his chin, hoping it would stop the pain or perhaps ease it. He was dimly thankful for the dark, glad that the others could see this agony. He heard a sound escape him, a wavering moan. There was a second, a third. George, he cried. George, I'm sorry. I never meant for anything bad to happen. Perhaps there was something else to say, but he could not say it. He was sobbing then, lying on his back with one arm over his eyes, remembering the boat, remember the steady beat of the rain against his bedroom windows, remembering the medicine and the tissues on the night table, the faint ache of fever in his head and in his body, remembering George, most of all that, remembering George in his yellow hooded slicker. George, I'm sorry, he cried through his tears. I'm sorry, please, I'm sorry. And then they were around him, his friends, and no one lit match, and someone held him. He didn't know who, Beverly maybe, or maybe Ben or Richie. They were with him, and for that little while the darkness was kind. 10. Derry. 5:30 a.m. By 5:30, it was raining hard. The weather forecasters on the Bangor radio station expressed mild surprise and tendered mild apologies to all the people who had made plans for picnics and outings on the basin of yesterday's forecast. Tough break folks, just one of those odd weather partners that sometimes developed in a Pentecost Valley with startling suddenness. On WZON, meteorologist Jim Witt describes what he called an extraordinary disclined low-pressure system that was putting it mildly conditioned, went from cloudy in Bangor to showering in Hampton to drizzle in heavy to moderate rain in Newport. But in Derry, only 30 miles from downtown Bangor, it was pouring. Travelers on row 7 found themselves moving through water that was 8 inches deep in places and beyond the Rulinan Farms. A plugged culvert in a dip had covered the highway with so much water that the highway was actually impassable. By 6 that morning, the Derry Highway portable had orange detour signs on both sides of the dip. Those who waited under the shelter on Main Street for the first bus of the day to take them to work stood looking over the railing of the canal, where the water was ominously high in its channel. There would be no flood, of course. All agree on that. The water was still 4 feet below the high water mark in 1977, and there had been no flood that year. But the rain came down with steady pounding persuasions, and thunder grumbled in the low clouds. Water ran down up Mile Hill in streams and roared in the storm drains and sewers. No flood, they agreed, but there was a pattern of unease on every face. At 5:45, a power transformer on a pole beside the abandoned Tracker Brothers truck depot exploded in a flash of purple light, spraying twisted chunks of metal onto the central roof. One of them flying chunks of metal severed high-tension wire, which also fell on the roof, spluttered and twisted like a snake shooting an almost liquid stream of sparks. The roof caught fire in spite of the downpour, and soon the department was blazing The power cable tumbled from the roof to the weedy verge that led around to the lot where small boys had once played baseball. The Derry Fire Department rolled for the first time that day at 6:02 a.m. and arrived at Tracker Brothers at 6:09. One of the first firemen off the truck was Calvin Clark. One of the Clark's twins with Wom, Ben, Beverly, Richie, and Bill had gone to school. His third step away from the truck brought the sole of his leather boot down on the live line. Calvin was electric almost instantly. His tongue popped out of his mouth, and his rubber fireman's coat began to smolder. He smelled like burning tires at the downtown dump. At 6:05 a.m., residents of Murrett Street in the Old Cape felt something that might have been an underground explosion. Plates fell from shelves and pictures from walls at 6:06. Every toilet on Murrett Street suddenly exploded in a glacier of shit and raw sewage as some unimaginable reversal took place in the pipes which fed the holding tanks of the new waste treatment plant in the Barriers. In some cases, these explosions were strong enough to tear holes in the bathroom ceilings. A woman named Annie Stewart was killed when an accident gear wheel catapulted from her toilet along with a grout of sewage. The gear wheel went through the frosted glass of the shower door and passed through her throat like a terrible bullet. As she watched her hair, she was nearly decapitated. The gear wheel was a relic of the Kitchener Ironworks and had found its way into the sewers almost 3/4 of a century before another woman was killed when the sudden violent reversal of sewage driven by expanded methods and gazins caused her toilet to explode like a bomb. The unfortunate woman, who was sitting on the john at the time and reading the current Banana Republic catalog, was torn to pieces. At 16:19 a.m., a bolt of lightning struck the so-called Kissin Bridge, which spanned the canal between the Bassin Park and Derry High School. The splintered pieces were thrown high into the air and then rained down into the swiftly moving canal to be carried away. The wind was rising at 6:30 a.m. The garage and the lobby of the courthouse building reconsidered it at just over 15 miles an hour by 6:45. It had risen to 24 miles an hour at 6:46 a.m. to Mike Hanlon awoke in his room at the Derry House Hospital. His return to consciousness was a kind of slow dissolve for a long time. He thought he was dreaming. If so, it was an odd sort of dream, an anxiety dream. His old psych prof, Doc Appleson, might have called it. There seemed to be no overt reason for the anxiety, but it was there all the same. The plain white room seemed to shrink menaces. He gradually realized that he was awakened. The plain white room was a hospital room. Bottles hung over his head, one full of clear liquid, the other a deep dark red one. Whole blood. He saw a blank TV set bolted to the wall and became aware of the steady sound of rain beating against the window. Mike tried to move his legs. One moved freely, but the other's, his right leg, wouldn't move at all. The feeling in that leg was very faint, and he realized it was tightly bandaged. Little by little, it came back. He had settled down to write in his notebook, and Henry Bowers had turned up a real blast from the past. A gold gasser. There had been fight, and Henry. Where had Henry gone? After the others. Mike groped for the call bell. It was draped over the head of the bed, and he had it in his hand. When the door opened, a nurse stood there. 2 buttons of his white tunic were unbuttoned in, and his dark hair giving him a rumpled Ben Casey look. He wore a St. Christopher medal around his neck, even in a soupy, only 3/4 awake state. Mike paled. Mike placed him immediately in 1958. A 16-year-old girl named Cheryl Lemonick had been killed in Derry, killed by it. The girl had a 14-year-old brother named Mark, and this was him. Mark, he said weakly, I have to talk to you. Shh, Mark said. His hand was in his pocket. No talk. He walked into the room, and as he stood at the front foot of the bed, Mike saw with a hopeless chill how blank Mike Lomanick's eyes were. His head was slightly cocked, as if hearing distant music. He took his hand out of his pocket. There was a surge in it. "This will put you to sleep," Mark said, and began to walk towards the bed. 11. Under the city. 6:45 a.m. "Shh," Bill cried suddenly, although there had been no sound except their own faint footsteps. Richie struck the light. The walls of the tunnel had moved away, and the five of them seemed very small in his pace under the city. They huddled together, and Beverly felt a dreamy sense of deja vu as she observed the gigantic flagstones on the floor and the hanging nets of cobweb. They were close now, close. "What do you hear?" she asked Bill, trying to look everywhere as the match in Richie's hand burned down, expecting to see some new surprise, some come lurching or flying out of the darkness. Rode in anyone, the alien from that gruesome movie with Cedrance Weaver, a great scuttering rat with orange eyes and silver teeth. But there was nothing, only the dusty smell of the dark, and the far away the thunder of running water as if the drains were filling up. "Something wrong," Bill said. "Mike?" "Mike?" Eddie asked. "What about Mike?" "I felt it too," Ben said. "Is it, Bill, did he die?" "No," Bill said. His eyes were hazy and distant, unemotional. All of his alarms was in his tone and the defense posture of his body. He swallowed. There was a click in his throat. His eyes widened. Oh no," Bill Beverly cried, alarmed. "Bill, what is it?" "What? Grab my hand," Bill screamed. "Quick!" Richie dropped the match and seized one of Bill's hands. Beverly grabbed the other. She groped with her free hand, and Eddie gasped it feebly with the hand at the end of his broken arm. Ben grasped his other hand and complete the circle by holding Richie's hand. "Send him our power," Bill cried in that same strange deep voice. "Send him our power. Whatever you are, send him our power. Now, now, now!" Beverly felt something go out from them and towards Mike. Her head rolled on her shoulder in a kind of ecstasy, and the harsh whistle of Eddie's breathing merged with the headlong thunder of water in the drains. 12. "Now," Mark Leomintic said in a low voice. He sighed, the sigh of a man who feels organs approaching. Mike pushed the call button in his hands again and again. He could hear it ringing at the nurse's station down the hall, but no one came. With a kind of hellish second sight, he understood that the nurses were sitting around down there, reading the morning paper, drinking coffee, hearing his call bell, but not hearing it, hearing but not responding. They would respond only later, when it was all over, because that was how things worked in Derry. In Derry, some things were better not seen or heard until they were over. Mike let the call button fall from his hands. Mike bent toward him, the tip of his cendron glittering. His St. Christopher medal swung, hemisvastical back and forth, as he drew the sheet down. "Right there, he whispered, the spectrum inside again. Mike suddenly he felt power washed into him, some primitive power that crammed his body like volts. He sniffed figures splaying out as if in a convulsion. His eyes widened. A grunt jerked out of him, and that sense of dreadful plagiarism was driven from him as if by a roundhouse slap. His right hand pisted out towards the night table. There was a plastic pitcher there, in a heavy cafeterian-style water glass beside it. His hand closed around the glass. Lemonic sensed the change. That dreamy, pleased light disappeared from his eyes and was replaced by warmy confusion. He drew back a bit, and then Mike brought the glass up and smashed it into his face. Lemonic screamed and staggered backward, dropping the syringe. His hands wet to the sprouting face. Blood ran down his wrists and splashed on his white tunic. The power left as suddenly as it had come. Mike looked dully at the shards of broken glass on the bed and his hospital Johnny and his own bleeding hand. He heard the quick, light sound of creeps soled shoes in the hall approaching. Now they come, he thought. Oh, yes, now. And after they're gone, who'll show up? Who'll show up next? As they burst into his room, the nurses, who had sat calmly on the station as his called bell rang faintly. Mike closed his eyes and prayed for it to be over. He prayed his friends were somewhere under the city. He prayed they were all right. He prayed they would end it. He didn't know exactly who he prayed to, but he prayed nonethelessly. 13. Under the city. 6:54 a.m. He's all right, Bill said presently. Ben didn't know how long they had stood in the darkness, holding hands. It seems to him that he had felt something come from their circle, go out and then come back, but he did not know where that thing, if it existed at all, had gone or done. Are you sure, Big Bill? Richie asked. Yes, Bill released Richie's hand and Beverly's, but we have to finish this quick as we can. Come on. Don't have so much as a pea shooter among us, Ben thought. But that's part of it, isn't it? Chud. What does that mean? What was it exactly? What was its final face? And even if we didn't kill it, we heard it. How did we do that? The chamber they walked through, it could no longer be called a tunnel, grew larger and larger. Their footfalls echoed. Ben remembered the smell, that thick zoo smell. He became aware that the matches were no longer necessary. There was light now, light of a sort of ghastly effulgence that was growing steadily stronger. In that marchy light, his friends all looked like walking corpses. Wall up ahead, Bill, Eddie said. No. Ben felt his heart begin to pick up speed. There was a sour taste in his mouth, and his head had begun to ache. He felt slow and frightened. He felt fat. The door, Beverly whispered. Yes, here it is. Once 27 years before, they had been able to pass through that door by doing no more than ducking their heads. Now they would have to walk their way through, or crawl on hands and knees. They had grown. Here was final proof, if final proof were needed. The pulse points in Ben's neck and wristed felt hot and bloody. His heart had picked up a light and rapid flutter that was close to arthropathy, pigeon pulse. He fought randomly and licked his lips. Bright greenish-yellow light flooded out from under the door. It shot through the ornament keyhole in a twisted shaft that looked almost thick enough to cut. The mark was on the door, and again they all saw something drift different in that strange device. Beverly saw Tom's face. Bill saw Audrey's server, head with blank eyes that stared at him in dreadful cautions. Eddie saw a grinning skull poised over two crossed bones, the symbol for poison. Richie saw the bearded face of a degraded Paul Bunyan, eyes narrowed to killer slits, and Ben saw Henry Bowers. Bill, are we strong enough? He asked. Can we do this? I don't know, Bill said. What if it's locked? Beverly asked in a small voice. Tom's face mocked her. It's not, Bill said. Places like this are never locked. He placed the tented fingers of his right hand on the door. He had to bend over to it and pushed it, swung open on the floods of sick yellow-green light. That zoo smell wafted out at them. The smell of the past become the present, horribly alive, obscenely vental. Roll, wheel, Bill thought randomly and looked around at them. Then he dropped to his hands and knees. Beverly followed, then Richie, then Eddie. Ben came last, his flesh crawling at the feel of Agent Grint on the floor. He passed through the portal, and as he straightened up in the weird glow of fire, crawling up and down the dripping stone walls and snakes of light, the last memory socked home with the force of a physic battering ram. He cried out, staggering back, one hand going to his head, and his first incorrect thought was no wonder Stan committed suicide. Oh God, I wish I had. He saw the same expression of stunned horror and drawn realization on the faces of the others as the last key turned in the last lock. Then Beverly was clinging to Bill as it raced down the gossamer current of its webbing, a nightmare spider from beyond time and space, and spider from beyond the fervid imaginings of whenever inmates may live in the deepest depths of hell. No, Bill thought coldly. Not a spider eater, not really, but his shape isn't one. It picked out of our minds. It's just the closet our minds can come to. The deadlights, whenever it really is. It was perhaps 15 feet high and as black as a moonless night. Each of its legs, which as thick as a muscle builder's thigh. Its eyes were bright, malevolent, rubies, bludgeoned from sockets, filled with some dripping, colored fluid. Its jagged mandibles opened and closed, dripping ribbons of foam, frozen in an ecstasy of horror, trodden on the brick of utter luminous. Ben observed with an eye of the storm, calm, that this foam was alive. It struck the stinking stone flag door, and then began to whiff away into the cracks like potrozone. But it's something else. There's some final shape, one that I can almost see the way you might see the shape of a man moving behind a movie screen while the show is on. Some other shape, but I don't want to see it. Please, God, don't let me see it. And it didn't matter, did it? They were seeing what they were seeing, and Ben understood, somehow, that it was imprisoned in his final shape, the shape of a spider by their common, unsought, and unfathered version. It was against this it, that they would live or die. The creature was squealing, mewling, and Ben became quite sure he was hearing sounds it made twice in his head, and then, a split second later, in his ears, telepathic. He thought, I'm reading its mind. Its shadows was a squat egg that raced along the ancient wall of this keep. What that was its lair. Its body was covered by coarse hair, and Ben saw that it was possessed of a stinger long enough to impale a man. A clear fluid dripped from its tip, and Ben saw that this was also alive. Like a Sullivan, the poison whiffered away into the cracks of the floor. Its stinger, yes, but fought below that. Its belly bulged grossly, slightly, heading utterly towards their leader, towards Big Bill. That's its egg sac, Ben thought, and his mind seemed to shrink at the implication. Whenever it is beyond what we see, this representation is at least syllabical, correct. It's female, and it's pregnant. It was pregnant then, and none of us knew except Stan. Oh, Jesus Christ, yes, it was Stan. Stan, not Mike. Stan who understood. Stan who told us. That's why we had to come back, no matter what. But it is female. It's pregnant with some unimaginable spawn, and its time has drawn close. Incredibly, Bill Deprug was stepping forward to meet it. Bill, no, Beverly screamed. Stay back, Bill shouted, without looking around, and then Richie was running toward him, shouting his name. And Ben found his own legs in motion. He seemed to feel a phantom stomach swaying in front of him, and he welcomed this sensation. Got to become a child again. He thought incorrectly. That's the only way I can keep it from driving me crazy. Gotta become a kid again. Got to accept it. Somehow. Running, shouting Bill's name, vaguely aware that Eddie was running beside him. His broken arm flopping, the belt of the bathrobe Bill had kinged around it, now trailing on the floor. Eddie had drawn his aspartame. He looked like a crazed Malinosis gunslinger with some weird pistol. Ben heard Bill below. You killed my brother, you fucking bitch! Then it was rearing up over Bill, burying Bill in its shadow, its legs pawing the air. Ben heard its eager mewling, looked into its timeless evil eyes, and for an instant did we see the shape behind the shape, saw lights, saw an endless, crawling, hairy thing, which was made of light and nothing else, orange light, dead light, that mocked life. The ritual began for the second time.